The third reason that evolution is false is the reason of thermodynamics. We could say the second law of thermodynamics in particular.
I am going to make a bet here. This guy does not understand the second law of thermodynamics if he thinks that the second law of thermodynamics refutes evolution. So let's see.
And the idea of entropy. And this really states in layman's terms that things work from order to chaos or from order to disorder. If you make a hot cup of tea and leave it on the side, it will go cold. Heat dissipates in the natural environment. If you leave things alone, if you leave an ordered system alone, it will eventually break down into chaos and disorder. And so you see, for instance, if you were to buy a car and just leave it sat on the streets and you came back to it 50 years later without having driven it, it wouldn't work. The battery would be dead. It would be rusty because entropy happens. The same for a garden. I'm sure that someone watching this is perhaps a keen gardener. I've done a little bit myself. And I know this for a fact. If you leave your garden for weeks and weeks and months, the garden does not get better. It gets worse. Things that are ordered and organized, left to themselves, nature left to itself, becomes disorganized, disordered, and chaos. This means it's a downward spiral, whereas evolution requires an upward spiral. And so evolution is in conflict with the second law of thermodynamics and the idea of entropy.
Well, so he kind of understands the second law of thermodynamics in a weird way, because on the one hand, when he describes like the battery depleting over time, that's a good example of the second law of thermodynamics. A coffee cup going from hot to cold, that's a good example of the second law of thermodynamics. A rusty car is not a fucking good example. A garden is not a good example. Him saying that, an organized garden will descend into chaos, just simply meaning that, it will no longer be an organized sort of garden. It just, things pop up and sprout everywhere. Weeds get in there and everything like that. When we're talking about evolution, we're not talking about a disorder like that. What we're talking about is moving to the equilibrium point of zero energy, or just equal energy. And so that's what the second law of thermodynamics is about. And that's why the tea or the hot going to cold and the battery losing its charge, those are good examples of that. Now, the key thing that he seems to not understand here are the differences between a closed system and an open system. In a closed system where there's a finite amount of energy that exists within the system, that energy will slowly run down to the equilibrium point. That's a closed system. Now, with an open system, you constantly have energy being introduced to the system. That is what the Earth is, an open system. We constantly get energy from the sun, and through that we have what seems to be everlasting energy source. Well, I mean, the sun's going to go out one day, but for the purposes of like 4.5 billion years of evolution goes, there's a constant flow of energy being introduced. And so that means that the second law of thermodynamics does not apply here, and it does not refute evolution. Also, I want to point out with the garden, in the way to understand the second law of thermodynamics to, the discussion of evolution goes, if you leave a garden alone, it's not going to just die. It's not just going to wither and it's going to be barren. If that were the case, then, all plant life on this earth would have died out billions of years ago. But that's not what happens. You see, nature's going to fucking nature, okay? And because of all the new energy that's introduced to the system every day by the sun, that means that the plants will grow and they will overtake that garden. And I mean, sure, it's disordered to you, but it's ordered as far as nature goes, because that's what happens. Plants grow. When they go into hibernation, they look like they're dead, but then they come back whenever spring comes back around. And all of that is incredibly ordered, and nature is gonna fucking nature. So his whole garden idea here does not mesh well with the second law of thermodynamics either.